In the stillness of the night, there is a whisper that lingers, a soft murmur of things that have long passed. It's as though the world itself holds its breath, waiting to share its ancient secrets. The wind, light and gentle, caresses the remnants of forgotten temples. Dust swirls in the quiet spaces where once the feet of gods and men walked. The ruins stand like silent witnesses to a time when the gods themselves were alive in the hearts of those who believed in them. And now, as the shadows of the past stretch out beneath the moon, the stories of those forgotten ages float in the air like fragile threads, waiting to be remembered. The sound of the wind is ever present, whispering through the cracks in stone, through the branches of ancient trees that have witnessed centuries unfold. It tells a tale, a story of beginnings, of gods, of mortals, and of death, the eternal cycle that threads through all things. Each moment that passes, each whisper in the dark, holds a part of this story, a story that began long before any of us could remember, stretching back to a time when the earth was young, when the first flames were lit, and when the first stone was set in place to build the world. In the quiet, in the solitude of the night, we are not alone. The souls of the past linger here, their voices lost in the wind, their presence felt in the warmth of a fading light. Their whispers tell us of a world that was, of a time when the gods were not distant figures written about in dusty scrolls, but living, breathing beings who walked among us. And Hades, the god of the underworld, the ruler of the realm of the dead, was once part of that world. But before we could understand his role, before we could know him for what he was, there was a time, quiet, serene, unbroken by the chaos that would come, that set the stage for all that was to follow. The air is thick with the weight of ages. In the darkness we can almost hear the voices of those who lived in that long-forgotten time. Their footsteps echo softly in the chambers of our minds, carried to us by the winds that blow through the ruins. The ancient cities, once bustling with life, are now still, their stones cracked and weathered by centuries of neglect. Yet even in their decay, there is a beauty, a reminder of what once was. The faintest traces of what they left behind linger in the air, whispers of power, of grace, of sorrow. And through it all, the river of souls flows gently beneath the surface, waiting to claim those who have passed, to carry them to the land of the forgotten. Time stretches before us like a vast, unbroken river. We cannot see its end, nor can we know when it began. But in this moment, in this space between breaths, we are caught between the past and the present, between the living and the dead. The gods may have long since departed, but their stories remain, woven into the very fabric of the earth. Each stone, each shard of pottery, each piece of forgotten lore tells a story, a whisper of the past, carried to us across the centuries. The land is quiet, yet beneath the silence there is the steady hum of life, of history. It is as though the very earth itself remembers what has come before. The earth, like the river, holds the memories of those who have gone, and in the stillness, those memories resurface, unbidden. For the gods too were once part of this world. Hades, who rules the underworld, once walked among the living, but long before he became a figure of darkness and death, long before he took his place among the shadows, there was another time. It was a time of order, of calm, a time when the world was still in the hands of the gods. The world that came before was not as we know it now. The air was filled with the scent of fresh earth and the promise of endless summers. The gods too were in their prime. They were mighty beings, their power reflected in the creation of the world itself. It was a time of balance, a time when the gods and the mortals lived side by side, each playing their part in the great dance of life. Hades, even then, was present, though not yet the figure of dread he would later become. He was one of many gods, each with their domain, their purpose, their realm. But as with all things, time moves forward. The stillness of the world was bound to change. The gods, as eternal as they were, could not remain untouched by the ebb and flow of time. Their stories, like the whispers in the wind, would eventually fade into legend. And yet, even as the stories of the past began to slip away, they were not forgotten. They lingered in the air, drifting through the cracks in the stone, waiting for those who would listen. The gods were not immortal in the way we think. Their power, their majesty, their very being was tied to the world they helped shape. They could not escape the passage of time, and though they ruled over mortals, it was not their fate to remain unchanged. Like the river, like the seasons, the gods, too, had their time. And as the ages passed, so did the gods. Their names, their deeds, their powers, all slipped away, like sand through an hourglass. In the stillness of the night, the river of souls flows on, its current steady and unbroken. It is a reminder of the cycle of life and death, a cycle that the gods themselves could not escape. And as we listen to the whispers of the past, we are reminded that even the most powerful beings are subject to time. Their stories may fade, their names may be forgotten, but the river of souls flows on, carrying them to their final resting place. It is a journey we all must take, in time. And so, as the wind blows through the ruins, as the whispers of the past continue to echo in the air, we are reminded that all things must eventually pass. Even the gods, in their eternal power, could not escape the pull of time. The river of souls, which flows through the heart of Hades' domain, is a testament to this truth. It carries the souls of the departed, from the greatest hero to the humblest mortal, to their final resting place. And in the stillness of the night, as we listen to the whispers of the past, we are reminded that time, like the river, waits for no one. In the end, we too will be carried away by the current of time, to join the souls that have come before us. But for now, we are here, listening to the whispers of the past, drifting along with the river of souls. The winds of time will carry us forward, just as they have carried those who have come before us. And in the end, we will find our place in the quiet of the night, where the whispers of the past linger, ever present, ever remembered. The story of Hades, of the river of souls, has only just begun. But for now, we rest in the quiet of the night, listening to the whispers of time, carried on the winds of memory. The journey has begun, and we are but travelers on a path that stretches into the distant past and the unknown future. The river of souls flows on, and we, like the gods, are part of its endless cycle. In the cradle of time, the earth stirred as if awakening from a long, deep slumber. The rivers, fed by the ancient rains, began their eternal journey from the mountains, winding through vast plains and fertile valleys. The soil, rich with the remnants of long-forgotten ages, welcomed the first steps of those who would become the builders of a new world. Here, in the dawn of civilization, life began anew, and from the fertile land, the seeds of greatness were sown. The early days of this world were not written in grand tomes or etched into towering monuments. No grand cities stood yet, nor vast empires. It was a time of quiet beginnings, when the winds carried the scent of earth and sea, and the stars above whispered the stories of creation. The first humans gathered around fire, sitting close to the flickering light, telling stories of gods and heroes, of strange creatures and distant lands. The gods, too, whispered in the hearts of these early people, their presence felt in every gust of wind and every murmur of the waves. As the first cities slowly took shape, humble and modest, the ancient world began to find its voice. Temples were raised in reverence, not yet to the mighty gods that would come, but to the forces that governed the world, earth, sky, and sea. These early structures, simple yet profound, became the heart of their communities, where the living and the divine could meet, if only for a moment. The people of these ancient cities did not yet know the great names of the gods we speak of today. They did not yet know the name of Hades, the ruler of the dead, but they knew the presence of something greater, something beyond the grasp of mortal hands. In the stillness of these early days, it was not yet time for death to wear the face of a god. Life was fresh, vibrant, and teeming with possibility. The world had only just begun to unfold, and the gods, still young in their power, had yet to take their full forms. It was a time of innocence, a time when the line between gods and mortals had not yet become so sharply defined. The gods moved among the people, offering blessings, guidance, and the occasional warning. But there were no great tales yet, no epic battles, no wars between gods and titans. The people lived quietly, weaving their stories into the very fabric of the earth. It was in this world, so new and full of promise, that the seeds of Hades were planted, not as a dark figure, not yet a lord of the underworld, but as a being born of the same earth, the same sky, the same ancient forces. He was one among many, a god of balance, tied to the very fabric of life and death. His presence was not yet a shadow to be feared, but a quiet force that moved beneath the surface of the world, unseen but ever present. The winds whispered his name, though the people did not yet know it. His power was not yet understood, but it was felt in the cycle of the seasons, in the ebb and flow of the tides, and in the quiet passing of the days. The first civilizations were built upon a fragile foundation, as all things are in their beginnings. They grew slowly, like plants pushing through the earth, their roots reaching deep into the soil of the past, their branches stretching toward the future. The early people, though unaware of the intricacies of the gods' realms, knew that the land was alive, that it held something ancient, something powerful. And as the cities grew, so did their understanding of the forces that governed the world. They looked to the stars for guidance, to the sun for warmth, and to the moon for light in the darkness. They understood that the world was a vast and interconnected place, where life and death, light and dark, were not opposites, but two sides of the same coin. As the people of these early cities began to grow and thrive, they turned their attention toward building monuments, structures that would stand the test of time. These were not yet the grand temples of the latter days, but small shrines and altars, made of stone and clay, dedicated to the forces that shaped their world. The people knew that in order to live in harmony with the earth, they must honor the gods, those unseen forces that moved through the land and sky. They did not yet know Hades, but they worshipped the earth, the sky, and the sea, forces that would one day be governed by him. The gods, in their earliest forms, were not distant and aloof, but intimately connected with the lives of the people. They did not live in far-off realms, but walked among the mortals, watching over them, guiding them. The boundaries between the mortal world and the divine were not yet so rigid. The gods were still part of the fabric of the world, woven into the landscape, into the very air the people breathed. And in this world, where the gods were still young and the land was full of potential, it was not hard to believe that they were present in everything. The whisper of the wind, the rustling of the trees, the flow of the rivers. Though the people did not yet understand death in the way we think of it now, they knew that life was a cycle, a never-ending journey from one moment to the next. They understood that the earth, like the seasons, was forever in motion, moving from life to death and back again. It was a quiet, peaceful time, full of reverence for the natural world. And it was in this reverence, in this understanding of life's cycles, that the seeds of Hades' power were quietly planted. For even in the gentlest winds, even in the most peaceful moments, death is always present, waiting in the shadows, a part of the world's great tapestry. The early civilizations did not fear death, for they understood it as a part of the world's natural rhythm. They did not yet know the name of Hades, but they knew that death, like life, was an integral part of the world. It was not something to be feared, but something to be acknowledged and respected. In this way the gods began to take shape, each one a reflection of the forces that governed the world. And among them, though still quiet, though still unseen, Hades began to take his place. As the centuries passed, the world grew, and so did the myths. The stories of gods and mortals were told and retold, growing in complexity and grandeur. The gods took on more defined roles, and their realms became more distinct. But even as the myths grew and evolved, there remained a quiet thread running through them, a reminder of the time when the gods were young and the world was still new. In the silence between the stories, the name of Hades echoed softly, as if waiting for the moment when his full power would be realized. And so the foundations were laid, small at first, then larger and larger still. The temples, the cities, the monuments grew. The gods took their places, each one carved from the stone of time, and though the people did not yet know the full story of Hades, his presence was already woven into the fabric of their world, his name whispered in the winds, waiting for the moment when the great river of souls would finally begin to flow. For in the beginning, there was no great divide between the gods and the mortals. They were all part of the same great cycle, the same eternal flow. And though Hades would one day come to rule the underworld, in these earliest days he was just another god, a quiet force among many. Yet, even then, the world was already turning toward the day when his name would become synonymous with death, when the river of souls would begin to carve its path through the ages. It was a time of quiet beginnings, a time when the earth and the heavens were still young, and the gods had not yet fully taken their places. But the stage was being set, and the world was ready to begin its long, slow journey into the mythic past. And as the first civilizations rose, so too did the whispers of the gods, carried on the wind, reaching out to us across the centuries. Thus the story of Hades began, not in darkness but in light, as a quiet force among many. And though the world was still young, the shadows of death were already creeping in, as they always had been, as they always would be. The cycle had begun, and the river of souls had begun to flow. As the world settled into its rhythms, and the cities that rose from the dust of the past began to flourish, a sense of order emerged, a quiet harmony between the gods and mortals. The earth seemed to breathe in unison with the people who called it home. The winds carried whispers of wisdom, and the sun, though no longer a child, cast its light upon a world that had grown into something beautiful. The first rays of civilization touched the land, and the people, in their innocence, felt that they were part of something greater. They looked to the gods for guidance, offering their prayers and sacrifices, and in return, the gods bestowed blessings upon them. It was an age of quiet peace, when the world felt at its fullest and most complete. In the villages and towns, the sound of daily life echoed through the air. Children laughing, farmers tending to their crops, and artisans shaping their creations with hands that had known the weight of centuries. The people knew nothing of the chaos that would one day come. They lived with an understanding that the world as it was would remain. There was no need for fear, no need for war. The gods, in their benevolence, kept the world in balance, and the mortals, in their humility, acknowledged the forces that governed them. It was a time when the gods were not distant figures on high, but were present in the very air, in every leaf that fluttered from the trees, in the steady flow of the rivers that wound through the land. In this era, the gods were seen not as abstract beings whose names were chiseled into cold stone, but as forces woven into the fabric of life itself. Their presence was felt in the quiet murmur of the earth, in the scent of flowers blooming in the early morning light, and in the sound of the wind moving through the branches of ancient trees. They were not distant, but present in the daily workings of the world. And among them, though he was often unseen and unheard, Hades moved silently, his influence spreading through the world in ways that were not immediately understood. Hades, at this point, was not yet the god of shadows that we know today. He was a god of the earth, a keeper of balance, though his role was not always clear to the mortals who worshipped him. He was part of the fabric of the world, like all gods, though his presence was often felt in the quieter moments, the whisper of wind over a quiet field, the flicker of a dying flame. In the peace of the Age of Order, Hades was a force that kept balance, a quiet god who ensured that life and death flowed as one. His realm was not yet the dark and terrifying place it would one day become. It was simply a part of the natural cycle, a necessary counterpoint to the joys of living. The mortals, in their innocence, had no reason to fear the gods. They lived in harmony with the earth, with the animals that shared the land, and with the gods who watched over them. They understood that the earth was a living, breathing entity, as much a part of the divine as the gods themselves. It was a world in which the heavens and the earth were in perfect harmony, each influencing the other in quiet, subtle ways. The gods, in their wisdom, guided the people, not with the heavy hand of tyranny, but with the gentle touch of guidance. Their laws were not written in stone, but were instead felt in the rhythm of life itself. The Age of Order was a time when the gods were not feared, but revered. They were seen as protectors, as guides, as forces of nature whose presence shaped every aspect of the world. Mortals turned to the gods for wisdom and strength, and in turn the gods offered their guidance in subtle ways. The world seemed full of possibility, for there were no great wars to mar the beauty of life. The sky was clear, the land was fertile, and the people, though simple in their understanding, knew that they were part of something larger than themselves. In this world, Hades was still a god of balance. His name was not yet synonymous with death in the way it would later come to be. Instead, he was a god whose role was tied to the land, to the cycles of nature. He governed not just the dead, but the earth itself. He watched over the harvests, the turning of the seasons, and the flow of the rivers. His influence was felt in every aspect of life, though his presence was often hidden, like the roots of a tree that stretched deep beneath the earth, unseen but ever present. For Hades, the passage of time was not marked by the events of the living, but by the subtle shifts in the earth, the slow change of the seasons, and the steady march of the years. Life, in the Age of Order, was a gentle rhythm. The people understood that death was as much a part of life as birth, though they did not yet understand the full scope of its reach. They lived in harmony with the land, and in return, the land, though touched by the hand of death, offered them its bounty. It was a time when the gods did not intervene in the affairs of mortals, but simply observed, guiding with a light touch, ensuring that balance was maintained. But even in this time of peace, there were whispers that something more lurked beneath the surface. The gods, though powerful, were not invincible. Their reign, like all things, was tied to the passage of time. The Age of Order, though tranquil, would not last forever. The cycle of life, like the seasons, would eventually change. It was not yet time for the great upheaval, not yet time for the gods to take on the weight of their greater roles. But even in this moment of peace, the seeds of the future were being sown, and Hades, though he had not yet taken on his dark mantle, felt the stirrings of change. The Age of Order, though a time of peace, was also a time of preparation. The gods, in their wisdom, knew that change was inevitable, that the world could not remain still forever. And so, though they did not yet know it, the gods were preparing for the great shift that would come. It was in this quiet time, in this moment of harmony, that the foundations for the future were being laid. And though Hades' role was still shrouded in mystery, he knew that the time would come when the world would need him in ways that it had never needed him before. The balance that had existed so gently for so long would soon be tested. The Age of Order was coming to its close, though no one knew it yet. The winds whispered of change, and the earth trembled in anticipation. But for now, there was still peace. The people still lived in harmony with the gods, and the gods, though aware of the winds of change, did not yet stir. It was a time when the world was as it should be, balanced, quiet, and full of promise. But even in this peace, the thread of fate was being woven. The Age of Order, though gentle, was only the beginning. The future was already taking shape in the hearts of the gods, and though Hades' name was not yet known as it would be in the stories of old, he too felt the stirrings of what was to come. For the cycle of life and death, like the earth itself, could not be denied forever. The balance would soon be tested, and the river of souls which flowed so gently in the early days would soon find its true course. For now, the world rested in the quiet order of the gods, but as the world turned, so too did the wheel of fate. And in the silence between the seasons, the story of Hades, of the Underworld, and of the River of Souls began to take shape, ready to unfold when the time was right. As the years passed, the world began to take shape in ways that could be seen and touched. The quiet balance that had existed for so long began to give way to ambition to create, to build, to leave a mark upon the earth that would echo through the ages. The early structures that had risen from the earth, simple and humble, grew larger, more intricate, and more refined. The people, guided by the gods and inspired by the quiet peace of their world, turned their attention to the building of monuments, temples that touched the heavens, statues that seemed to breathe with life, and cities that sprawled across the landscape, each one a testament to the greatness of mankind. These structures, rising from the earth like giants, were not built in haste or in chaos. No, they were crafted with patience, with reverence, and with a deep understanding of the forces that governed the world. Each stone was placed with care, each column raised with purpose. The builders, though they did not yet know the full extent of their power, were aware of the legacy they were creating. They understood that the structures they erected were not just buildings, but symbols of human ambition, of the desire to reach for something greater, something eternal. And as they worked, the gods looked on, their hearts swelling with pride at the creations of their mortal children. The world was alive with activity as the builders of dreams set their hands to the task. The air was filled with the sound of chisels against stone, the hum of craftsmen shaping marble, and the rhythmic beat of hammers striking anvils. It was a time of creation, of forging something from nothing, and the people poured their hearts into their work. The temples they built were not merely places of worship, but monuments to the divine. They were designed to honor the gods, to house their statues, to capture their essence in stone. Each temple was a prayer in itself, a silent offering to the forces that had shaped the world. And yet there was more to these creations than mere devotion. The temples, the statues, the cities, they were not only expressions of piety, but of the human desire to immortalize their own existence. The builders understood, perhaps not in words but in their hearts, that death would one day come for them, as it did for all things. But they also understood that the marks they left upon the earth could outlast them, that their creations could live on long after their bodies had turned to dust. In a world where everything was in constant motion, where the seasons turned and the tides rose and fell, there was something eternally reassuring in the idea of building something that would stand forever. The monuments they created were, in a sense, a reflection of their understanding of the gods themselves. The gods who ruled over the heavens and the earth were eternal, untouched by time. And in their creations the builders sought to mimic this divine permanence. The temples were not simply structures, they were an attempt to capture the essence of the gods and to bring that essence down to earth. They were a way of making the divine tangible, of creating something that could stand as a bridge between the mortal and the immortal, between the living and the dead. Hades, in this time, was still a distant presence, a god whose realm was unseen, whose influence was felt but not fully understood. His role was not yet one of terror, nor was it one of power over the living. He was simply a god, one among many, whose domain was the quiet and the unseen. His influence could be felt in the land, in the changing seasons, in the quiet flow of rivers that carried the souls of the departed to their final rest. But in the world above, in the world of the living, Hades was not yet the dark figure that he would one day become. He was a force of balance, a keeper of the cycles of life and death, but he was not yet the ruler of the underworld that would strike fear into the hearts of mortals. It was during this time, when the world was filled with the sound of creation and the air was thick with the weight of ambition, that the foundations for the future were laid. The builders of dreams worked not only with their hands but with their hearts, pouring their hopes and dreams into the structures they created. They built temples to honor the gods, but they also built cities to honor themselves, to prove that they too could leave a mark upon the world. In their ambition, they sought to transcend the limits of their mortality, to create something that would outlive them, something that would endure long after they were gone. The gods, too, watched the builders with a quiet sense of satisfaction. They had given their mortal children the tools to create, and the builders had used them to shape the world. The gods were not idle observers, but active participants in the unfolding of the world. They had set the wheels of creation in motion, and now they watched as the mortals took those wheels and turned them into something greater. The gods, in their wisdom, understood that the creations of the mortals were not just acts of ambition, they were acts of reverence. The mortals were building in honor of the divine, even if they did not fully understand the depths of that reverence. But there was, as there always is, a shadow lurking at the edge of this time of creation. For even in the age of order, even in the time when the world seemed to hum with the vibrancy of life, there were forces that could not be ignored. The gods, for all their power, were not immune to the passage of time. They too were subject to the cycles of life and death, of creation and destruction. The builders of dreams, for all their ambition, could not escape the reality of their own mortality. And as they worked to immortalize themselves, they unknowingly laid the groundwork for the changes that would come. Hades, though he was not yet the figure of dread that would one day rule the underworld, was already a part of the world, already shaping the future in ways that would not be fully realized until much later. His role as the god of balance, as the keeper of the cycle of life and death, was already being woven into the fabric of the world. The builders of dreams, in their desire to create something eternal, had unknowingly touched upon the deeper truths of existence, that all things, no matter how grand, must eventually fall.
As the sun set on this age of creation, as the last rays of light cast long shadows over the monuments of stone and marble, the world seemed to hold its breath. The builders had done their work, had crafted their dreams into reality, and the gods looked on, proud of their children's accomplishments. But even as the world basked in the glow of human achievement, the river of time continued to flow. its current steady and unyielding. The gods, though they had given life to the world, could not control its inevitable course, and as the river of time carried them forward, they knew that the age of creation would one day give way to something else, something darker, something that would change the world forever. The age of order, though it had been a time of peace and creation, was not destined to last. The world was shifting, and the builders of dreams had unknowingly set the stage for the forces that would one day come. The monuments they had created, though beautiful and enduring, were built upon the foundations of time, and time, as the mortals knew, was a fleeting thing. Even the gods were not immune to its reach. And so, as the last stones were laid and the last statues were carved, the world stood on the cusp of change. The builders, proud of their creations, could not know that the very forces they had honored in their work would soon shape their world in ways they could not imagine. The river of time had begun its journey, and the gods, though they had guided its course, could not stop its flow. The age of order was ending, and the world was about to enter a new phase, a phase in which the gods and mortals alike would face the consequences of their actions. The world, it seemed, had reached a golden moment. It was a time of peace, of prosperity, a time when the gods looked down with favor upon the mortals, and the earth yielded its abundance with ease. The cities, which had once been mere collections of stone and clay, now flourished into thriving centers of culture, knowledge, and art. The air was filled with the sound of laughter, the clang of metal, the soft murmur of poets reciting verses to an eager audience. In the marketplaces, merchants peddled their goods, and the scent of fresh bread mixed with the spices of distant lands. The people had found their place in the world, and for a time it seemed as if nothing could disturb the tranquility they had come to enjoy. This was the age of gold, the moment when the human spirit, nourished by the peace and bounty of the earth, soared to its greatest heights. It was a time of creation, of innovation, of dreams realized. The great works of architecture, art, and literature that had begun in the earlier ages now blossomed fully into being. Temples of grandeur, their marble pillars gleaming in the sunlight, were built not only to honor the gods but also to serve as symbols of the greatness of the people who created them. Sculptors shaped stone into forms of beauty, while painters filled the walls of palaces with vivid depictions of life, gods, and heroes. The people were not just living, they were thriving, their lives full of purpose, meaning, and connection to the divine. The gods, too, reveled in this time. It was as if the very fabric of the earth had been woven into perfection, and all was as it should be. They walked among the people in their temples, listening to the prayers of mortals, offering their blessings. There was a sense of unity, a shared understanding that the world was in balance. The seasons flowed as they should, the rivers meandered calmly toward the sea, and the sun rose and set with quiet regularity. The gods, who had once been distant and aloof, were now seen as companions, guardians who watched over the world they had helped shape. Yet, even in the midst of this perfect peace, there was a subtle undercurrent, a murmur that was not immediately heard but could be felt in the very air. It was a whisper carried on the wind, a sense that something was shifting beneath the surface. The age of gold, though it glowed with the radiance of accomplishment and harmony, was not meant to last forever. Even in its greatest moments, there was a quiet reminder that all things must change, that the river of time never flows in one direction for long. The gods, in their infinite wisdom, knew this truth, knew that the very peace that had been so carefully cultivated could not endure indefinitely, for even the golden age must eventually give way to the shadows of what comes after. And so the people continued their lives, unaware that the threads of fate were slowly being woven into a pattern they could not yet comprehend. They celebrated their victories, built monuments to their success, and basked in the warmth of the sun. But as the days passed, small cracks began to appear in the perfect facade of their world. These were not the cracks of destruction, but the subtle fractures that come when time moves forward, when the natural order begins to shift in ways that are barely perceptible. The gods, though they remained at the height of their power, could not ignore the pull of these changes. They too understood that the great river of time had its own course to follow, and that course was beginning to take the world into new and unknown territory. It was in this age of plenty, in this moment of calm, that the seeds of a new era were quietly being sown. Mortals, content in their abundance, began to look beyond the needs of the present and toward the future. Their aspirations grew higher, their desires deeper. They had tasted the sweetness of peace and prosperity, and now they began to wonder what more they could achieve. They sought not just to live in harmony with the gods, but to surpass them, to reach higher, to claim more. The golden age, which had been built on a foundation of respect and reverence, began to be tested by the very things that had given it its shine: ambition, pride, and a thirst for greater power. In the shadows, the gods too began to stir. Though they had been generous in their blessings, they could not help but feel the stirrings of something darker. The mortals had built their world upon the divine gifts they had been given, but now it seemed the mortals were turning their attention towards something beyond the gods. They sought not just the favor of the gods but their power, their dominion over the earth itself. It was not enough to revere the gods, they now sought to master the forces that governed the world, to take control of the natural order itself. Hades, though he had long been a figure of quiet power, began to feel the shifting tides. His realm, the Underworld, had always existed in the shadows, a place where the souls of the departed passed on to their final rest. But now, as the mortals' ambition grew, so did their curiosity about what lay beyond death. They began to see the Underworld not as a place of balance and quiet, but as a place to be understood, a place to be explored. The mysteries of life and death, of the passage of time, became more than just the natural course of things. They became subjects of fascination, of obsession. The gods, in their wisdom, watched as the mortals began to turn their eyes to realms beyond their reach. The Golden Age, for all its beauty, had begun to lose its innocence. The mortals, who had once seen the gods as protectors, now began to see them as obstacles. They sought to surpass the gods, to conquer the very forces of nature and time itself, and in this pursuit, they unwittingly disturbed the delicate balance that had held the world together for so long. Hades, though still a god of balance, began to see the growing tension between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The mortals, in their quest for greater understanding, began to push against the boundaries that had always separated them from the divine. They sought to understand death, to harness its power, and in doing so they unknowingly invited chaos into a world that had once been at peace. The Age of Gold, though it had brought prosperity and peace, was beginning to show signs of strain. The golden light that had once bathed the earth now seemed to cast longer shadows. The peace that had once been so carefully crafted began to feel fragile, as if it could be shattered by the very ambition that had created it. The gods, who had once been the silent protectors of the world, now found themselves facing a challenge they had not anticipated. The mortals were no longer content to live in harmony with the world around them. They wanted more, and so, as the world glistened with the light of human achievement, a sense of unease began to settle in. The gods too felt the weight of the change that was coming. Hades, in his quiet way, could feel the undercurrents of unrest. He knew that the time of harmony was coming to an end, that the river of time was about to carry the world into a new age, one that would not be as gentle or as peaceful as the golden age that had preceded it. The winds of change were stirring, and though they were still faint, they were beginning to grow stronger. The Age of Gold, for all its beauty and tranquility, was beginning to fade, and in its place, something darker, something more uncertain was beginning to take shape. The mortals had built their world with their own hands, and now they were on the cusp of something that would change everything. The Golden Age was over, and the next chapter of the world's story was about to begin. As the Golden Age began to fade into memory, the world shifted, imperceptibly at first, like a ripple across a calm sea. The delicate balance that had sustained so much beauty and peace began to falter, as the ambitions of mortals, once content in their harmony with the gods, grew ever more insistent. It was as if the very breath of the earth had changed, its pulse quickening, urging the people onward, towards something greater, something unknown. The foundations upon which the Golden Age had been built were beginning to crack under the weight of human desire, that insatiable force that had always been a part of the mortal heart. It was a time when the gods, though still revered, began to feel the shifting tides of their influence. The mortals, whose lives had once been shaped by the rhythms of the earth, began to look beyond the natural world, beyond the simple cycles of life and death, and toward a future of their own making. They began to question the limits of their power, to wonder what it would be like to wield the forces of the world for their own purposes. The gods, who had once been the silent stewards of the earth, now found themselves facing a new challenge, a challenge that would test the very nature of their rule. Desire, in its many forms, began to take root in the hearts of mortals. It started as a quiet whisper, a longing for more wealth, more power, more understanding. But soon it grew louder, taking on the shape of insatiable hunger, the desire to control the very forces that had once been beyond their reach. The mortals, though they had once lived in reverence to the gods, now began to seek dominion over the natural world. They looked at the stars and wondered if they might one day hold them in their grasp. They turned their eyes to the earth, to the rivers, the mountains, the forests, and began to see them not as gifts of the gods, but as resources to be exploited. And in this ambition, in this hunger for more, they unknowingly disturbed the balance that had kept the world in harmony. Hades, though a quiet figure in the shadows, felt the stirring of change. As the god of the underworld, he had always understood the importance of balance, the delicate equilibrium between life and death, between creation and destruction. He had always been content to watch over the souls of the departed, guiding them along their final journey, ensuring that the cycle of life continued uninterrupted. But now, as the world shifted, he felt the stirring of something darker, something that threatened to upset the natural order. It was not the weight of death that troubled him, but the increasing desire of mortals to control the very forces that governed life itself. The mortals, in their quest for more, began to push against the boundaries that had once separated them from the gods. The gods had long been the stewards of the earth, guiding the flow of time, the rise and fall of civilizations, the ebb and flow of the seasons. But now, the mortals were beginning to think that they too could wield these forces, that they too could shape the world according to their own will. They sought to understand death, not as a natural end, but as a power to be harnessed, a force to be controlled. The Underworld, once a place of mystery and reverence, now became the subject of study, a realm to be understood, if not conquered. This desire to control the world's deepest mysteries was not born of malice, but of a longing for power and understanding. The mortals, having tasted the sweetness of their golden age, now sought to push the boundaries of what they had accomplished. They desired knowledge, not for the sake of wisdom, but for the sake of mastery. They sought to understand the gods, to peer into the very fabric of existence, and in doing so, they began to unravel the delicate threads that held the world together. As the mortals reached toward the divine, the gods watched with a growing sense of unease. They had long understood the importance of balance, of maintaining the natural order. They knew that the world could not be shaped solely by human desire, that there were forces beyond their control, forces that governed the cycles of the earth and the heavens. But now, the mortals were no longer content to live within those boundaries. They sought to break free, to transcend the limits that had once held them in check. Hades, too, understood the danger of this desire. As the god of death, he was intimately familiar with the natural cycle of life and death, and he knew that the balance between these forces was fragile. The mortal desire to transcend death, to control it, threatened to disrupt this balance. It was a temptation that could lead to disaster, for in seeking to control death, the mortals risked forgetting that it was an essential part of life, a necessary counterpoint to the joys of living. To seek to master death was to deny the very essence of existence. But even as Hades watched the mortals with growing concern, he could not help but understand their desire. After all, he too had once been a part of that world, a god who had lived among the mortals, who had once been a part of their ambitions. The gods, in their own way, had all sought to understand the mysteries of existence. They too had sought power, not for its own sake, but to fulfill their roles in the grand design of the world. But the gods had learned the importance of balance, and it was that balance that the mortals were now in danger of destroying. The shadow of desire loomed large over the world, casting a darkened veil over the once bright days of the Golden Age. The gods, though they remained powerful, could feel the weight of the change. The mortals were no longer content to live in harmony with the natural world. They sought to control it, to shape it in their own image. And in this pursuit, they began to push against the very forces that had sustained them, that had allowed their world to flourish in the first place. The winds, which had once carried whispers of peace and prosperity, now carried the scent of something darker, something that hinted at the unraveling of the world's delicate balance. The gods, though they had been silent observers for so long, now found themselves at a crossroads. They had given the mortals the gifts of creation and understanding, but they had not anticipated the consequences of those gifts. The desire for power, for mastery over life and death, had set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. Hades, who had always been a keeper of balance, now found himself standing at the edge of a precipice. The world was changing, and with it, the nature of his own role. He had always been a quiet god, a god of death and rest, but now he was being called to something greater, something more urgent. The forces of the world were shifting, and the time for quiet observation had passed. The shadow of desire had begun to cast its long, darkened fingers across the earth, and Hades knew that it was only a matter of time before the balance would be disrupted beyond repair. The age of gold, once a time of peace and prosperity, was now fading into the past, leaving behind a world that was beginning to feel the weight of its own desires. The mortals, driven by ambition and curiosity, had unknowingly set the stage for the unraveling of the world they had so carefully crafted. The shadow of desire loomed large, and in its wake, the quiet forces that had once guided the world were now stirring, preparing to confront the consequences of the mortals' actions. The balance between life and death, creation and destruction, was on the verge of being shattered, and the gods, once the silent stewards of the world, could no longer remain passive in the face of such change. The winds of change were blowing ever stronger, and as the gods prepared for what was to come, Hades too knew that his time had come. The shadow of desire, which had once been a whisper, was now a roaring storm, and the world was about to be swept away in its wake. The winds, which once whispered of harmony and prosperity, now howled with the fury of change. The Golden Age, though it had shone so brightly, was beginning to unravel. What had once been a time of peace and creativity now felt like a distant memory, as the very fabric of the world seemed to fray at the edges. The ambition of mortals, which had once driven them to build, to create, to explore, had now turned inward, towards something darker. The desire to control the forces of life and death, to shape the world in their own image, had begun to consume them. It was as if the heavens themselves trembled in the face of this growing unrest, and the gods, who had once been the silent guardians of balance, now found themselves caught in a storm they could not ignore. The mortals, in their pursuit of power and mastery over the world, had begun to disturb the very forces that had kept them safe. They had once revered the gods, understanding that the world was a delicate balance, a dance between creation and destruction, life and death. But now, they sought to break free of that cycle, to transcend the boundaries that had always defined them. They no longer saw themselves as part of the grand design, but as masters of their own fate. And in this hubris, they began to break the crown of their own creation, to shatter the harmony that had once held the world together. Hades, who had always been a figure in the shadows, felt the weight of this shift more keenly than most. As the god of the underworld, he had always understood the importance of balance. He knew that life and death were two sides of the same coin, that one could not exist without the other. But now, as the mortals began to push against the natural order, he felt the ground beneath him begin to tremble. The quiet realm of the dead, once a place of rest and renewal, now felt like a place on the edge of collapse. The souls that had passed into his realm seemed restless, as if they too sensed the upheaval in the world above. It was as if the flow of time itself was being interrupted, and the very essence of existence was being pulled in new, chaotic directions. The gods, who had watched over the world for so long, now found themselves at a crossroads. They had given the mortals the tools of creation, the gifts of knowledge and understanding, and had watched with pride as the people built their world. But they had not foreseen the consequences of their gifts, the insatiable desire for more, for power, for control. The mortals had begun to see the gods not as guardians, but as rivals. They sought to challenge the very forces that had shaped the world, to stand at the same height as the gods themselves. And in their arrogance, they had begun to break the sacred bonds that had held the world in place. The golden age, which had been a time of peace, was now over. The crown that had once gleamed with the light of prosperity was now broken, its jewels scattered and lost. The gods, though they had once been revered, now found themselves at the mercy of the mortals they had created. It was as if the mortals, in their desire for more, had begun to tear down the very structures that had given them life. And the gods, who had once guided the course of the world with gentle hands, now found themselves struggling to maintain the balance. Hades, who had long been a quiet observer, now found himself at the heart of the storm. He had always understood that death was not something to be feared, but something to be respected. It was a natural part of the cycle of life, a necessary counterpart to birth and growth. But now, as the mortals sought to transcend death, to control it, to bend it to their will, he felt the very foundations of existence begin to crack. The natural order, which had once flowed like a river, was now rushing toward the precipice, threatening to spill over into chaos. In his quiet realm, Hades began to prepare. He had long known that change was inevitable, that the cycle of life and death could not be held in stasis forever. But he had not anticipated the force of the mortals' desire, their hunger for more. The balance that had once been so carefully maintained was now teetering on the edge, and it was only a matter of time before it would break entirely. And when it did, the world would change forever. The gods, once the stewards of creation, would no longer be able to maintain control. The mortals, in their quest for mastery, would have to face the consequences of their actions. The once serene underworld, a place where souls passed peacefully into their rest, was now a place of unrest. The souls, who had once made their journey in peace, now seemed anxious, unsettled. It was as if the very nature of their passage had been disturbed, as if the forces of life and death had become disjointed, no longer flowing in their natural course. And Hades, though he had always been a god of calm and order, now felt the weight of this disruption. The souls, once content to rest in the quiet peace of the afterlife, now seemed to drift aimlessly, as if uncertain of their place in the world. The gods, who had once been the silent guardians of the world, now found themselves struggling to maintain their dominion. The balance that had once been so carefully upheld was slipping away, and they could feel the power shifting, slipping from their grasp. It was as if the world, once so full of promise and possibility, was now spinning out of control, pulled in 1,000 different directions by the desires of mortals and the forces of nature. Hades, as the god of the underworld, knew that he could not stop the tide of change that was sweeping over the world. He could not hold back the flow of time, could not prevent the natural course of life and death from unfolding, but he could feel the coming storm, the one that would reshape the world and change everything. He knew that the balance of life and death was fragile, that even the slightest shift could send the world into chaos. And he understood that the mortals, in their desire for more, had already begun the process of shattering that balance. The world, once a place of harmony and peace, was now on the brink of destruction. The crown of the golden age had been broken, and its jewels scattered. The gods, once the silent stewards of the earth, now found themselves struggling to hold the pieces of the world together. Hades, though he had always been a god of death and endings, now found himself standing at the edge of a new beginning. The world was changing, and with it, the roles of the gods and mortals. The balance that had once held the world in place was no more, and the future, uncertain and unknowable, awaited. The age of harmony had passed, and now, the age of uncertainty had begun. The gods, though they had long ruled over the world, now found themselves at the mercy of the forces they had once controlled. And Hades, who had long been a god of quiet repose, now stood at the precipice of a new world, a world that would be shaped not by the will of the gods, but by the desires of mortals. The crown had broken, and the world would never be the same. The world, once so calm and full of promise, had now begun to tremble under the weight of its own desires. The golden age, that fleeting moment of peace and prosperity, had faded, and the quiet balance that had held the gods and mortals together seemed to be slipping away. A storm, not of thunder and rain, but of ambition and restlessness, had begun to gather. The mortals, once content to live in harmony with the natural world, now sought to break free from the bonds that had defined them. Their hunger for knowledge, for power, for mastery, had driven them to the very edge of their existence. And as they reached out toward the divine, the heavens themselves seemed to stir, as if to warn them of the dangers they were courting. In the cities, the streets buzzed with the energy of change. The once quiet marketplaces now hummed with the sound of merchants and philosophers, poets and soldiers, all speaking of a new age, a new world that was waiting to be born. The cities, which had once been symbols of peace and order, now felt like places on the brink of something darker. The ambition of the people, once focused on creating beauty and harmony, had now turned inward, towards something more dangerous. They no longer saw the world as a gift from the gods, but as something to be conquered, to be shaped according to their will. The gods, though they had once walked among the mortals, now looked down from their distant thrones, uneasy. They had watched the mortals grow, had seen them build and create, but they had never anticipated the depths of their ambition. The gods had given the mortals the tools to shape their world, but they had never imagined that they would seek to master the very forces of life and death themselves. And now, as the mortals reached toward the heavens, the gods felt the first stirrings of fear. Hades, though he had always been a figure of quiet power, felt the winds of change more keenly than most. As the god of the underworld, he had always understood the delicate balance between life and death, creation and destruction. He had watched as the mortals built their cities and temples, as they celebrated the beauty of the world they had been given. But now, he saw something different, something darker. The mortals, in their desire for more, were pushing against the natural order, seeking to control forces they did not fully understand. And in their pursuit, they were disrupting the very balance that had held the world together. The storm, which had begun as a whisper, was now a rising roar. The people in the cities spoke of their desire to transcend death, to escape the inevitable end that came for all things. They no longer accepted the natural course of life and death as a divine gift. Instead, they saw it as a chain, a barrier to their greatness. They spoke of immortality, of bending the very fabric of existence to their will. And in their pursuit of this impossible dream, they began to tear at the threads that held the world together. The gods, once content to let the mortals live as they would, now found themselves in a battle for control. The natural order which had been maintained for so long was slipping away. The gods had always understood the importance of balance, but they had never realized how fragile that balance truly was. Now, as the mortals reached for the stars, they began to feel the weight of their own desires. The heavens themselves seemed to tremble, as if the very foundation of the world was shaking under the force of the storm. Hades, though he had long been a quiet observer, now found himself drawn into the conflict. He had always understood the cycle of life and death, but now he saw that the mortals were challenging that very cycle. They sought to control death, to transcend it, to bend it to their will, and in doing so, they were threatening the very essence of existence. Hades, who had once been content to guide the souls of the departed, now found himself facing a challenge unlike any he had ever known. The world was changing, and he could feel the weight of that change pressing against him. The mortals, though they did not yet understand the consequences of their actions, had set in motion a chain of events that would change the course of history. The storm that had begun as a whisper was now a force of nature, one that could not be ignored. The gods, though they had once been the rulers of the world, now found themselves struggling to maintain control. The balance that had once held the world in place was now teetering on the edge of destruction.
In the cities, the tension was palpable. The people spoke of their dreams of immortality, of escaping the grasp of death, and of transcending the limits of their mortal bodies. They no longer saw themselves as part of the natural order, but as beings capable of reshaping the world according to their own desires. And as their ambition grew, so did the unease among the gods. The mortals, once content to revere the divine, now sought to stand in the same light as the gods themselves. They wanted more than just the favor of the gods. They wanted to control the very forces that governed the world. Hades, though he had always been a god of quiet power, now felt the storm of change bearing down on him.
He had always understood the importance of balance, but now, as the mortals pushed against the natural order, he could feel the world slipping away from him. The balance that had once been so carefully maintained was now under threat. The storm that had been gathering for so long was now crashing down upon the world, and Hades knew that there was no turning back. The gods too could feel the weight of the storm. They had long ruled over the world, guiding the course of events, but now they found themselves struggling to maintain their place. The mortals, once their children, now sought to take their place, and in their desire for more, they were pulling the world apart. The storm, which had begun as a quiet rumble, was now a force of nature that could not be denied. The heavens themselves seemed to tremble in the face of this new force. Hades, who had always been a god of death and endings, now found himself facing a new beginning. The world was changing, and with it his role in it. The storm that had once seemed distant, a mere whisper on the wind, was now a raging tempest. The mortals, in their quest for more, had set in motion events that would reshape the world. And as the storm grew, Hades knew that the balance that had once held everything together was now breaking apart. The world would never be the same again, and neither would he. The storm over the city, though it had begun as a simple whisper, had now become a full-blown tempest. The winds of change were howling, and the gods, once so confident in their power, now found themselves caught in the storm. The world, which had once been a place of harmony, was now teetering on the brink of chaos. The storm had come, and there was no telling what would be left in its wake. The storm, which had once seemed distant, now roared across the heavens, its winds carrying with them the promise of change. The world had begun to shift, and the gods, who had once guided the course of history, now found themselves struggling to maintain their grasp on the order they had created. The mortals, in their desire for more, had begun to pull apart the very fabric of existence. The balance that had once held the world together was now slipping through their fingers, and the empire that had once been the shining beacon of civilization was now beginning to fade, its light dimming like the last flicker of a dying flame. In the cities, the once vibrant marketplaces had fallen silent. The sounds of merchants and traders, philosophers and poets had been replaced by the harsh clamor of soldiers and rulers, each seeking to assert their dominance over the crumbling empire. The cities, which had once been symbols of peace and prosperity, now felt like decaying ruins, their streets filled with the ghosts of a bygone era. The world, once so full of promise, now seemed to be spiraling toward its inevitable end, as the mortals sought to control the forces that had always been beyond their reach. The gods, too, could feel the weight of this change. The once immovable thrones of Olympus now seemed precarious, as if they too were being pulled into the storm. The mortals, who had once looked to the gods for guidance, now sought to overthrow them, to take their place at the very heart of creation. The world, which had once been a harmonious blend of divine will and mortal effort, was now a battleground, with each side seeking to assert its dominance. The balance that had once sustained the world was now teetering on the edge of collapse. Hades, though he had long been a god of death and endings, now found himself standing at the precipice of something much greater than he had ever known. The empire that had once ruled over the earth was crumbling, its once great cities now little more than echoes of their former glory. The gods, who had once watched over the mortals with a sense of pride, now saw the inevitable decline of the world they had built. The natural order, which had always been a quiet force in the background, was now being torn asunder by the desires of mortals. The storm that had once seemed like a whisper was now a full-blown tempest, and there was no turning back. The people, though they had once lived in harmony with the gods, had now become consumed by their own desires. The pursuit of power, of immortality, of control over life and death, had led them to challenge the very forces that had sustained them. They had forgotten the lessons of the past, the wisdom of the gods, and in their arrogance they had begun to unravel the world they had once built. The empire, once the pride of civilization, was now in its death throes, its final days marked by the clash of wills between the gods and the mortals. Hades, who had always been a god of quiet observation, now found himself at the heart of this struggle. He had long understood the delicate balance between life and death, between creation and destruction. But now, as the world shifted, he felt that balance slipping away. The forces of the earth, the very fabric of existence, were being torn apart by the ambition and desires of mortals. The gods, who had once ruled over the earth with a sense of calm and authority, now found themselves facing a world they no longer recognized. The once great cities, now crumbling under the weight of their own desires, seemed to reflect the state of the empire itself. The once beautiful temples, which had once stood as monuments to the gods, were now falling into ruin, their marble columns cracked and broken. The The streets, which had once been filled with the laughter of children and the songs of poets, now echoed with the sounds of desperation and despair. The world, which had once been so full of life and promise, now seemed like a fading memory, a dream slipping through the fingers of those who had once held it so tightly. Hades, though he had always been a god of endings, now found himself watching as the world around him began to unravel. The empire, which had once stood as a symbol of human achievement, was now crumbling under the weight of its own hubris. The mortals, once content to live in harmony with the gods, had now become consumed by their own desires, seeking to control the very forces of life and death, and in doing so, they had begun to destroy the world they had once built. The gods, who had once guided the course of history, now found themselves helpless in the face of the destruction that was unfolding before them. They had long understood the importance of balance, of maintaining the natural order, but now that balance was slipping away. The mortals, in their desire for more, had pushed against the very forces that had kept them alive. They had forgotten the wisdom of the gods, the ancient knowledge that had once guided them, and in their arrogance, they had set in motion the collapse of their own world. The final days of the empire were marked by chaos and confusion. The once great cities, now filled with the echoes of their former glory, seemed to be sinking into the earth, as if the weight of their own ambition had caused the very foundations of the world to crack. The heavens, once so full of light and promise, now seemed dark and distant, as if the gods themselves had turned away from the world they had once ruled. The natural order, which had always flowed in the background like a quiet river, was now in turmoil, its waters muddied by the desires of mortals. Hades, though he had always been a god of death, now found himself standing at the crossroads of the world. The empire, once so full of life, was now on the verge of collapse. The gods, who had once been the stewards of creation, now found themselves facing a world they could no longer control. The balance that had once held the world together was now shattered, and the storm that had once seemed so distant was now upon them. The last light of the empire was fading, its once bright flame now nothing more than a flicker in the darkness. As the world fell into chaos, Hades understood that the time had come for the natural order to be restored. The empire, which had once been a symbol of human achievement, was now on the verge of destruction, and only through the intervention of the gods could the balance be restored. But even as he prepared to act, he knew that the world had changed forever. The empire that had once ruled over the earth was now nothing more than a memory, a story told in the whispers of the wind. The last light of the empire was fading, and with it the hope of a future built on the foundations of the past. As the last remnants of the empire drifted into the shadows of memory, a profound silence settled over the land. The once great cities, with their towering monuments and grand temples, now stood as crumbling ruins. The stone that had been carved with the names of kings and gods lay broken, its words barely visible beneath the weight of time. The streets, once filled with the vibrant sounds of life, now echoed only with the whispers of those long forgotten. The empire had fallen, and with it, the dreams and aspirations of a civilization that had once believed it could conquer time itself. The land, once so full of energy and purpose, now seemed desolate, as if the very earth had absorbed the sorrow of its people. The cities, which had once gleamed with the light of human achievement, now lay in ruins, their former glory obscured by the passage of time. It was as if the world had forgotten itself, its once bright future now dimmed to a faint memory, barely a flicker in the vast expanse of the ages. The gods, who had once watched over the empire with both pride and concern, now found themselves far removed from the world they had once shaped. They could no longer hear the voices of the mortals, the prayers and offerings that had once filled the air. The connection between the divine and the mortal had frayed, like an old rope unraveling with each passing year. The gods, once so close to the people, were now distant figures, their influence fading into the mists of time. They were no longer the guiding hands that had shaped the course of history, but distant echoes of a forgotten past. Hades, too, felt the weight of this change. As the god of death and the underworld, he had long been a figure of quiet authority, a silent watcher of the passing of time. He had seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations, each one believing it would endure forever, only to crumble into the dust of history. But even he could not help but feel the deep sadness that came with the fall of this particular empire. It was not just the physical destruction of cities or the fall of rulers that troubled him, it was the loss of something deeper, something intangible. The dreams of the mortals, the hope they had once held in their hearts, had been extinguished. The empire had been a reflection of their greatest achievements, their greatest aspirations, and now it was nothing more than a pile of forgotten ashes. The ruins, though they stood as silent witnesses to the passage of time, could not hide the traces of the empire's former glory. Here, in the dust and rubble, there were fragments of what had once been, a broken column, a weathered statue, a shattered temple. These remnants were like the forgotten memories of a people who had once believed in their own immortality, but whose dreams had crumbled into nothingness. The winds that blew through the empty streets seemed to carry with them the echoes of laughter and song, now lost to the ages. The world had moved on, but the ruins remained, as silent and unmoving as the gods themselves. As the mortals had reached for more, as they had sought to transcend the natural order, they had ignored the lessons of the past. The gods, though they had once warned them, had been powerless to stop the tide of ambition that had swept across the land. The empire, once full of hope and possibility, had fallen victim to its own desires. The mortals had sought to control the world, to shape it according to their will, but in doing so, they had destroyed the very thing that had made it beautiful, the balance between life and death, creation and destruction. They had broken the crown, and now the ashes of their empire lay scattered across the land. But even in the silence there was a sense of inevitability, as if the fall of the empire had been written into the fabric of the world from the very beginning. All things, even the greatest of empires, were destined to fade. The natural order of life and death, the cycle that had governed the world for as long as time itself, could not be ignored forever. The mortals had reached too far, and now they had paid the price. The gods, too, had witnessed this inevitable end, though they had been unable to prevent it. The empire, like all things, had come to its end, and yet, in the midst of the ruins, there was a quiet beauty. The broken statues, the crumbling temples, the shattered columns, they were not just symbols of destruction, they were also symbols of what had once been. They were the remnants of a civilization that had dreamed, that had aspired to greatness, even if it had fallen short. The ruins were a testament to the ambition of mortals, to their desire to create something lasting, something meaningful. Though the empire was gone, its spirit lingered in the dust and stones, in the very air that had once been filled with the sounds of life. Hades, as the god of death, understood this better than most. He had seen the rise and fall of many civilizations, each one believing it would be the one to last forever. But he knew, as he had always known, that all things must come to an end. The mortals, in their quest for immortality, had forgotten that truth. They had sought to transcend death, to break free from the cycle, and in doing so, they had brought about their own destruction. The empire had fallen, but it had not been in vain. It had left behind a legacy, a reminder of what had been, and of the fragile nature of existence. As Hades stood amidst the ruins, he felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. The world had changed, and with it, his role in it. The empire, once so full of life and promise, was now a shadow of its former self. The gods, who had once ruled over the earth, now found themselves distant and disconnected from the world they had once shaped. The mortals, though they had once sought the favor of the gods, now seemed to have forgotten them, lost in the pursuit of their own desires. The cycle of life and death, which had once been so clear, now seemed to be slipping away. But Hades knew, as he had always known, that the world would continue to turn, even in the absence of the empire. The ashes of the past would eventually give way to something new, something unknown. The cycle of life and death would continue, even as the ruins of the empire lay forgotten. The gods, though they may have been distant, would always be present, their influence felt in the quiet moments, in the passing of time. The empire had fallen, but the world would go on. The forgotten ashes would become the soil from which new dreams would arise, and though the ruins may be silent, they would continue to tell the story of what had once been. The world had long passed into a state of quiet reflection, the once great empire reduced to little more than whispers on the wind. The ruins, though forgotten by most, still stood as silent reminders of what had been. The gods, though distant, were not entirely absent, and in the stillness of time, their presence could still be felt. The earth, once full of the bustling energy of life, now seemed to move at a slower pace, as though the pulse of the world itself had been dampened by the loss of the empire. What had once been a place of vibrant creation and destruction, of dreams and ambitions, was now little more than a memory. Yet, in that memory, there was a quiet beauty, as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to emerge from the shadows of time. The centuries passed without fanfare, each one blending into the next, as the world continued its slow and steady progression towards something new. In the absence of human ambition and the gods' direct intervention, nature began to reclaim what had been lost. The once bustling cities had become overgrown with ivy and moss, their buildings consumed by the slow, relentless passage of time. The temples, once grand and shining, now stood like skeletal remains, their stone facades cracked and weathered by the centuries. Yet even in their decay, there was a sense of quiet dignity. They had once been symbols of power and glory, but now, in their silence, they seemed to embody something more profound: the impermanence of all things, the inevitable cycle of creation and destruction. The gods, though they had not abandoned the world entirely, seemed to retreat into the background, their influence less felt as the years wore on. They had once been active participants in the affairs of mortals, their presence woven into the very fabric of existence. But now, they had become distant figures, their stories fading into myth and legend. The mortals, too, had faded from the annals of history. The empire they had built was no more, and with it, the stories of their lives and deeds had been lost to time. Only the ruins remained, scattered across the land like forgotten echoes of a forgotten past. Hades, too, had watched from the shadows as the world had drifted into this state of quiet desolation. The once vibrant underworld, filled with the souls of the departed, now seemed to be at rest. The souls that passed through his domain no longer spoke of the grand ambitions they had once held, of the cities they had built, or the wars they had fought. Instead, they were silent, their whispers little more than a faint breeze that rustled through the endless dark. Even in death, the empire's once great dreams had been extinguished, fading into the abyss. Hades, who had always been the quiet keeper of the dead, now found himself in the midst of an endless silence, surrounded by the forgotten souls of those who had once lived. But though the world had grown quiet, there was still a sense of something lurking beneath the surface, as though the earth itself was waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The ruins, though they were decaying, still held a certain energy, a potential that had not yet been realized. The winds, which had once carried the sounds of life, now whispered secrets of the past, tales of a time when the world had been full of ambition and possibility. And in the silence of the centuries, there was a quiet yearning for something new, something to break the stillness and breathe life back into the world. In this silence, there were those who still sought the forgotten knowledge of the past. Though the empire had fallen, its legacy had not been completely erased. The ruins, though they seemed to be nothing more than crumbling stone and dust, still held within them the echoes of a great civilization. Scholars, explorers, and dreamers had begun to scour the land, searching for the lost wisdom of the past. They dug through the ruins, uncovered ancient scrolls, and deciphered the faded inscriptions that still clung to the walls of the temples. The world had not forgotten entirely, it had merely fallen into a deep slumber, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The gods, though they had retreated from the mortal world, had not abandoned their creation. They watched from their distant thrones, observing the slow passage of time. They knew that change was inevitable, that the cycle of life and death could not be suspended forever, and so they waited, patiently, as the world moved through its quiet age. It was in the silence of these centuries that the seeds of the future were planted, though no one could yet see them. The gods, who had once been active participants in the world of mortals, now found themselves playing a more subtle role, guiding the flow of time from the shadows. Hades, as the god of the underworld, too, played his part in this quiet cycle. He had always understood the nature of death, of the passing of time. He had seen civilizations rise and fall, seen the dreams of mortals burn bright and then fade away. But in the silence of these centuries, he began to see the deeper meaning behind it all. The fall of the empire, the fading of the gods' influence, the quiet decay of the world, these were all part of the natural order. Nothing lasted forever. Everything, even the gods themselves, was subject to the passage of time. Yet, as he observed the silence, he began to sense something else, something that stirred beneath the surface. It was as if the earth itself was not finished with its story. Though the empire had fallen, though the gods had withdrawn, there was still a sense that the world was waiting for something. The ruins, though forgotten by most, still carried the weight of their former glory, as though they held within them the potential for rebirth. The silence was not the end, it was merely the pause before something new emerged. Hades knew that this was the way of the world. Life and death were not separate, but part of the same cycle. Just as the empire had risen and fallen, so too would the world move forward, always in motion, always changing. The silence of the centuries, though it had seemed so complete, was not a void. It was a space for something new to take root, for new dreams to grow from the ashes of the old. The gods, though they had stepped back, were not gone. They were still watching, still waiting for the moment when the world would once again stir from its long slumber. And so, in the silence of these centuries, the world prepared for its next great chapter. The ruins, though they seemed to be fading into the past, were still full of potential. The forgotten ashes of the empire would not remain forgotten forever. In time, someone would come to remember, to reclaim what had been lost. The gods, though distant, would not remain silent forever. The world, though it had been still for so long, would eventually awaken to the sound of a new beginning. The silence of the centuries would end, and with it, the world would begin again. The earth had lain still for what seemed like an eternity, its surface silent, its ancient heartbeat faint beneath the weight of the centuries. The ruins, though weathered and forgotten, still held secrets in their cracked stones and faded inscriptions. In time, the world had moved on from the age of the great empire. its memory relegated to the dust and the gods to myth. But, as time flowed on like a quiet river, it was inevitable that someone would come searching. Someone would feel the pull of the past, the urge to uncover what had been lost to the world. And so it was that, after a long slumber, the past would stir again. Far removed from the cities and the forgotten temples, beyond the remnants of the Empire's grand vision, a new generation had begun to rise. These were not the children of the Empire that had once been. They were different, born of a world that had learned to survive without the guiding hands of the gods. Their eyes were turned outward, toward the unknown, and they sought the ancient things, the things buried beneath the earth, in the hope that they might discover something of value. But it was not gold or power they sought, not at first, but knowledge. The lost truths, the wisdom of the past, that had long been buried in the ruins of a once great world. It began as whispers, stories told by the elders, by those who had heard the tales passed down through generations, though they no longer knew the names of the cities, nor the faces of the rulers. These stories were half-remembered, vague fragments of something greater, fragments of a time when the gods had walked among men, and the land had been full of light and promise. These whispers had reached the ears of those who had no connection to the past, no stake in the forgotten empire, but the tales had begun to stir something deep within them, a yearning for something more, something that had been lost and was now waiting to be found. There was a small group of scholars and explorers, driven by curiosity and the desire to uncover the unknown, who had begun to travel the land, searching for the remnants of the empire. They were not the first to do so. Others had come before them, but their efforts had been met with failure, or worse, with silence. But these explorers were different. They had an understanding of what they sought. They did not simply want to unearth old stones or forgotten relics. They sought the stories, the history that had been buried beneath the earth, lost in the annals of time. They came to the ruins at the edge of the forgotten lands, to the crumbling temples, the weathered statues that still stood in defiance of the passing years. They dug through the earth, carefully lifting away the layers of dust and debris that had built up over the centuries. With each fragment they uncovered, they felt closer to the truth, to the heart of the empire that had once shone so brightly. But there were few answers, and even fewer clues to the mysteries they sought. The ruins, though they were majestic in their own way, seemed empty, as though the past had taken its leave, leaving nothing but echoes in the wind. And yet it was in these silent places that something began to stir. One of the explorers, a young woman named Alara, felt a strange pull as she walked through the crumbling halls of a once grand temple. She was drawn to the faint whispers that seemed to echo through the broken stone, and to the symbols that were etched into the walls. She could not explain it, but there was something in these marks, these ancient carvings, that resonated with her, something that spoke of a time long past, a time when the gods had been real, when the world had been full of wonder and terror, of life and death. Alara, along with her companions, spent many long months in the ruins, studying the symbols and the artifacts they uncovered. Slowly they began to piece together the story of the lost empire, the story of the gods who had once walked among men, and the empire that had crumbled beneath the weight of its own desires. They discovered that the empire had not fallen in a single cataclysmic event, but rather it had decayed over time, its once great cities sinking slowly into the earth, consumed by the ambition of mortals and the indifference of the gods. They learned that the gods had not abandoned the world out of malice or neglect, but because the balance that had once held the world together had been shattered. The mortal desire for power and immortality had reached too far, and in doing so they had caused the very forces that sustained the world to unravel. It was through these discoveries that the explorers began to understand the true nature of the empire's fall, and with that understanding came a sense of awe and trepidation. They had uncovered the remnants of something far greater than they had imagined. A world that had once been ruled by gods, where mortals had strived for something higher, something eternal, only to see it crumble in their hands. And yet, despite the ruin, there was a certain beauty in what they uncovered. The knowledge they had gained was not simply about the fall of the empire, it was also about the resilience of the human spirit, the will to continue, even after everything had been lost. In the heart of the temple, Alara uncovered something remarkable, a fragment of an ancient scroll, partially preserved beneath the earth. The scroll was written in an old script, one that had not been seen for centuries. As she carefully unrolled the fragile paper, she found that it contained not just a record of events, but a message from the gods, or perhaps from those who had once served them. It was a warning, a plea for balance, for the restoration of the order that had been lost. It spoke of the river of souls, of the delicate balance between life and death, and of the need to respect the forces that governed the world. For Alara, this discovery was a revelation. It was as though the gods, though they had withdrawn from the mortal world, had left behind a message, a final testament to their presence and their influence. The rediscovery of the ancient empire, of its lost wisdom, was not just about recovering the past. It was about understanding the present, about realizing that the cycle of creation and destruction, of life and death, continued even now, even in the silence of the centuries. And with that understanding came the realization that the world, though it had forgotten, was not lost forever. The ruins were not simply the remnants of a dead civilization, they were a message, a reminder that the past was never truly gone. It lingered, just beneath the surface, waiting to be rediscovered. As the scrolls continued to unravel the hidden wisdom of the lost empire, Elara and her companions found themselves drawn deeper into the past, not just in search of knowledge, but for a greater understanding of the world they lived in. The ancient texts spoke of a time when gods walked among men, when mortals dared to shape the very course of history. They were tales of ambition, of desires that reached too far, of greatness and decay intertwined like the vines that had overtaken the once proud temples. Yet, among these fragmented accounts, there lay a subtle truth that had been obscured by the sands of time. Life and death, creation and destruction, were not opposing forces, but part of an endless, ever-turning cycle. Elara, ever the curious scholar, found herself standing in the heart of a forgotten city, beneath the shadow of crumbling columns and broken statues. The air was thick with the weight of history, the silence only broken by the soft rustle of the wind, carrying with it the scent of earth and decay. It was here, in this forgotten place, that the past seemed to come alive, as though the very ground beneath her feet was whispering the stories of those who had lived, loved, and died here. The once great empire was gone, but its spirit, its essence lingered on in the ruins, an enduring reminder that nothing truly fades from the world. All things leave their mark, whether in stone, in memory, or in the souls of those who remember. As she traced her fingers along the weathered carvings on the walls, she began to understand the deeper meaning of what had been lost. The gods who had once ruled over the mortal realm had never truly been distant. They had merely stepped back, allowing humanity to find its own path. They had left behind their knowledge, their wisdom, not in the form of tangible power, but in the lessons they had imparted. The gods had shown the mortals how to build, how to dream, how to create, but they had also shown them the limits of those dreams. The empire, in its quest for immortality, had overreached, and in doing so, had set in motion its own decline. The gods had not abandoned the world, but had instead watched with a quiet patience, allowing the natural cycle to unfold. Elara's companions had found many such inscriptions, but none more profound than the one she now faced. This inscription was different. It was not just a record of the past, but a meditation on the nature of existence itself. It spoke of the river of souls, of the delicate balance between life and death. It told of a time when the gods had woven the threads of destiny, when every life had a purpose, and every death was part of a grand design. The Empire had once understood this balance, but in their desire to transcend it, they had caused their own undoing. As she read the words, Elara felt a deep sense of awe. The Empire had not been destroyed by external forces, but by its own refusal to accept the limitations of the world. The people had sought to conquer death, to escape the cycle that bound all living things, and in doing so, they had shattered the very foundation of their existence. The gods had warned them, but they had not listened, and so the Empire had fallen, not with a single catastrophic event, but with a slow unraveling, as the very forces that had once given it life turned against it. The lesson was clear: nothing in this world, not even the mightiest empire, could escape the natural order. The river of souls would continue to flow, regardless of the desires of mortals. Life and death were intertwined, and no matter how far one reached, no matter how high they soared, they could never escape the inevitable return to the earth. The gods had given the mortals a gift, a brief span of time to create and to dream, but they had also given them the responsibility to understand their place in the grand cycle. Elara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the words sink in. The silence of the ruins seemed to deepen around her, as though the very air was holding its breath. It was as if the world itself was waiting for her to understand, to grasp the truth that had been hidden for so long. And in that silence she realized that the knowledge she had uncovered was not just about the fall of the empire, it was about the way forward. The lessons of the past were not meant to be locked away in forgotten temples, they were meant to guide the future. The world, though it had forgotten, had not been abandoned. It was simply waiting for someone to remember. The wind picked up, rustling the pages of the ancient scroll she held in her hands. It was a reminder that time was ever moving forward, that the past was not a place to dwell in but a guide to the future. The lessons of dust were not to be feared but embraced. They were not about the mistakes of the past but about the opportunities that lay ahead. For Alara, this was a revelation. The rediscovery of the past was not an end, it was a beginning. The ruins were not just the remnants of a lost world, they were the foundation for a new one, built on the lessons of what had come before. As Alara looked out over the ruins, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The silence was no longer oppressive, it was serene. The past, with all its glory and tragedy, had given way to the present, and in that moment she understood. The river of souls flowed on, not just through the realms of the dead, but through every living thing. It was the current that connected all things, past and future, life and death. And in that flow there was a wisdom that could not be found in any temple or scroll, a wisdom that could only be understood through the passage of time. With this newfound understanding, Alara knew her work was far from over. She had uncovered the past, but now she must help the world understand it, to take its lessons and use them to build a future that honored the balance of life and death. The rediscovery of the Empire was not just about recovering ancient knowledge, it was about applying that knowledge, about weaving the lessons of the past into the fabric of the present. The Empire had fallen, but in its fall it had left behind something invaluable, a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of living in harmony with the natural order. As Alara made her way back through the ruins, she felt a sense of purpose settle over her. The journey was far from over, but now she was no longer just a seeker of the past. She was a bearer of its wisdom, a guide for those who would listen. The world had forgotten, but it was not lost. The river of souls flowed on, carrying with it the lessons of dust, the lessons of time, and the hope of what was yet to come. The world, in its ever-turning cycle, had always been in motion, ever-changing, ever-evolving. Yet the discovery of the ancient empire, of the gods and their lessons, had brought something deeper into focus for Alara and those who stood beside her. The past was no longer something to be merely observed from a distance. It had become a mirror through which the present could be seen in a new light. The scrolls, the inscriptions, the very ruins themselves spoke not just of what had been, but of what could be. The dreams of those who had lived and died in that lost world were not merely the echoes of a forgotten time, they were the seeds of a future that had not yet come to pass. Alara, standing in the midst of the ruins, felt the weight of this responsibility settle upon her shoulders. She had uncovered the lessons of the past, but now she must help others understand them. She had seen how the empire had risen on the wings of ambition and dreams, only to fall when those dreams were driven by pride, by a desire to transcend the natural order. The gods, though distant, had shown the way, had guided the empire in its early days, but in the end it was the mortals who had allowed their hubris to unravel all that had been built. And yet, Alara could not shake the feeling that there was something more, something that transcended the mistakes of the past. For all its flaws, the empire had been a place of great beauty, of art, of knowledge, of profound dreams. The ruins that stood before her were not just the remnants of a fallen civilization, they were the foundation of something new. The gods had retreated, but their legacy was not gone. The river of souls, which had once carried the dreams of the departed to the underworld, now flowed with new hopes, new possibilities. Alara's thoughts turned to the lessons of the past, lessons about balance, about the cycle of life and death, about the need to live in harmony with the natural world. The empire had learned these lessons too late, but perhaps in the quiet silence that had followed its fall, a new understanding could emerge. The world had learned the hard way that no empire, no dream could stand forever. But what if the lesson was not about the fleeting nature of ambition, but about the potential for rebirth? What if instead of seeking to conquer death, humanity could learn to live with it, to embrace the cycles that governed all life? The gods, though they had receded from the mortal world, had left behind a blueprint, a vision of how humanity might live in balance with the world. The empire, in its grandeur, had sought to transcend its own mortality, but perhaps the true path lay in accepting it, in understanding that life was but a fleeting moment in the grand scheme of time. The river of souls flowed on, carrying with it the essence of every life, every dream, every failure and triumph. In the end, it was not about avoiding the inevitable, but about living in harmony with it, about allowing the cycle to unfold as it was meant to. And so Alara began to think about the future. The world that had emerged from the ashes of the old empire was not the same, but it had potential. There was a quiet beauty in the silence of the centuries that had passed, a beauty that lay in the acceptance of the natural order. The ruins, though they were broken and weathered, were not hopeless. They were filled with potential. They were the remnants of a dream that had once been, but now they could be the foundation of a new dream. The gods had shown the way, but now it was up to humanity to find its own path. As Alara and her companions began to rebuild, to piece together the fragments of the lost empire, they understood that they were not simply preserving the past, they were honoring it. the lessons of the old world were not just about avoiding the mistakes that had led to its fall, but about embracing the possibilities that still existed. The cycle of life and death, of creation and destruction, was not something to be feared, but something to be understood. The river of souls, which had once carried the dreams of the departed, now carried the hopes of the living, as they sought to build a new world, a world that would learn from the mistakes of the past. The future was uncertain, but there was a quiet hope in the air, a sense that perhaps humanity could learn to live in balance with the world, to create not just for the sake of power, but for the sake of harmony. The gods, though they had stepped back, had left a legacy that could still be felt, a legacy that called upon humanity to dream, but to dream wisely, to reach for the stars, but to remember that they were mortal, that every dream was part of the same cycle that governed all things. And so the work of rebuilding began, not just of temples or cities, but of the very spirit of humanity. The past, though it had been lost, was not forgotten. It had been preserved in the ruins, in the scrolls, in the lessons that had been passed down through the ages. Now it was time to apply those lessons, to weave them into the fabric of the present. The future would be shaped not by the gods, but by the people who had learned from them. It would be shaped by those who understood the cycles of life, by those who could dream but also accept the limits of those dreams. The river of souls, which had once carried the dreams of the departed, would now carry the hopes of a new generation, a generation that had learned to live with the natural order, not against it. The gods, though distant, had left their mark on the world, but it was up to humanity to carry that mark forward, to build a world not of power, but of balance, of understanding, of dreams that honored the cycles of life and death. The dream of humanity, in its truest form, was not to transcend the natural world, but to live in harmony with it, to embrace its rhythms and its cycles, and to understand that every ending was but the beginning of something new. The last rays of the setting sun bathed the ancient ruins in a soft golden glow, as though the world itself was bidding farewell to the day. The wind, now a gentle whisper, stirred the dust of centuries-old stones, creating patterns that shifted like the memories of a forgotten time. Alara stood alone amidst the crumbled pillars, her eyes tracing the remnants of what had once been a vibrant city. The past, with all its grandeur and tragedy, seemed to hang in the air, alive with the weight of untold stories, as if the very stones held the echoes of those who had come before. In this quiet moment, she felt a deep connection with the souls of the past. Their lives, their dreams, their mistakes, and their triumphs. They were not just distant memories to be studied or forgotten. They were part of the same cycle, the same river of time that flowed endlessly through all generations. As she gazed out over the ruins, Alara realized that the work of the explorers, the scholars, and the dreamers was not just about recovering the past. It was about understanding how the past and the present were inextricably linked, how every moment, every action carried the weight of all that had come before. And yet in this quiet moment, there was no sense of mourning, no feeling of loss. There was only a sense of acceptance, a realization that the cycle of time was not something to resist, but something to embrace. Life had always been in motion, and with each passing day, it moved closer to its inevitable end. But that end, Alara now understood, was not a finality. It was a transition, a passing from one state of being to another. The past would always be with them, not as a burden or a shadow, but as a guide, a reminder of what had come before and what might yet come to be. As the sky darkened and the stars began to twinkle above, Alara felt a sense of peace settle over her. She was no longer the curious scholar who sought only knowledge for its own sake. She had become something more, someone who understood the importance of living with the cycles of time, of understanding that every beginning was tied to an end, and that every end held the promise of a new beginning. The work she had started, the lessons she had uncovered, were not just for the benefit of the present generation, they were a gift for the future, a way to ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated, that the dreams of the future would be built on a foundation of understanding and balance. The night air grew cooler, the sounds of the world around her growing faint as the earth settled into its evening stillness. It was in this quiet, in this space between the waking world and the dream world, that Alara felt the deepest connection to the past. The river of souls that had once carried the dreams of the departed now seemed to flow gently through her, a reminder that time was not a force to be feared, but a companion to be understood. And so, in this moment of quiet reflection, Alara whispered a prayer to the gods who had once ruled this land, not asking for guidance or favor, but simply giving thanks for the lessons they had left behind, for the dreams they had sparked, and for the timeless cycle that continued to flow through all things. The stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, as though the heavens themselves had heard her prayer and responded in kind. The world, with all its complexities and contradictions, seemed, for just a moment, to make sense. The empire had fallen, the gods had retreated, but life had endured. The lessons of the past were not just relics to be studied, they were the living foundation upon which the future would be built. And as the night deepened, Alara felt herself becoming part of that cycle, part of the dream that had been passed down through the ages. The story of the gods, of the empire, of the rise and fall of civilizations, was not just a tale of what had been. It was a story that continued, unfolding with each new generation, with each new dream. And in that story, Alara realized there was no final chapter, no ultimate conclusion. There was only the journey, the eternal journey of humanity, bound to the rhythm of time, moving forward, always forward, toward a future that was shaped by the lessons of the past. As the last echoes of the day faded into the stillness of the night, Alara turned and began to walk slowly back toward the camp. The firelight flickered in the distance, casting long shadows on the ground. The explorers were gathered there, their voices quiet as they spoke of the day's discoveries, of the work that still lay ahead. But Alara did not join them immediately. Instead, she paused for a moment, allowing the peace of the night to wash over her. The past was no longer a burden, nor was the future an unknown. Both were part of the same cycle, and she was a part of it, as were all those who came before, and all those who would come after. And so, as the night stretched on, Alara knew that the work of uncovering the past was far from over. There was still much to learn, much to discover, much to understand, but she no longer felt the urgency she once had. She had learned to accept that the answers would come in their own time, and that in the end, it was not about finding the final truth, but about living with the questions, with the mysteries, and with the endless flow of time. The past had been uncovered, the lessons had been learned, and now it was time to let them settle into the present, to carry them forward into the future. As she approached the fire, she felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the work that had been done, but for the very act of being part of this eternal cycle. And so, as the world around her settled into the quiet of the night, Alara whispered a final thought, a simple prayer, a wish for peace, for understanding, and for the continuation of the dream that had begun so long ago. And so, history sleeps again.